Good afternoon, everybody. I think most of you know our speaker this afternoon. He's appeared at HASC many times over the years, and this is his fourth appearance just this term. It's been quite a fall with the Supreme Court sessions and the election preview, and today we're going to put a big Christmas bow around all of this with the elections review. Dr. David Wrighton has a BA from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, a law degree from the University of Minnesota Law School, and a PhD from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He's in his 27th year as a member of the Hope College Political Science faculty. In that time, he's published numerous books and articles on such topics as the Supreme Court and the electoral process, religious liberty, faith-based sector/governmental partnerships, and other questions at the intersection of religion and politics. Dr. Wrighton is the author of The U.S. Supreme Court and the Electoral Process, and most recently, Church and State Documents Decoded, an authoritative source for understanding the evolving political and legal relationship between church and state from colonial times to the present day. If you'll join me in a visual clapping of the hands, let's welcome Dr. David Wrighton, and we'll get started.
Thank you, everyone. Boy, I hate to pick people out, but I just noticed my neighbor, Mrs. Zodaway, yeah, who is also the house of my late colleague, Jim Zodaway, who is just one of my dearest friends and mentors at Hope College in the political science department. So I will give him a shout out as well. Thank you all for joining in. I'm impressed, as I was saying. I thought many of you might just be exhausted with this seemingly interminable election season that goes on for years, and just were ready to check out, and I wouldn't have blamed you. I confess to feeling that way on occasion. And yet I'm glad you came, and I trust we'll have a lively conversation and exchange. I have my outline per usual. I trust there will be lots of comments and questions, and anything is fair game. This has turned out to be a fascinating election cycle, and just lots of kind of interesting, more micro kind of questions in terms of elections and our first pandemic election, but also macro level considerations for the two major political parties, both of whom are facing big challenges. And for our two-party system, which likewise, I think, is facing challenges. So I think this is a worthwhile endeavor. Brad and Kim, did the outline get circulated? Okay, so I don't, I don't have it pulled up, Brad. So I don't know if you do want to pull it up and if people want to look at it, or.
Yeah, everybody should have a copy.
If you want to email. Okay, if you want to put it in the chat, maybe people could pull it up as well. But so what I'd like to do, so as Kim said or Brad said, please feel free to put your comments in the chat, or if you're on my screen, wave at me, and if I see you, I will stop as well. I'll make a point to stop at a few points. I can't talk for an hour and 15 minutes or whatever we have. And you ought to feel free at any point in time to insert a comment or a question, and we can deal with things as we go. What I want to do real quickly is just kind of run numbers and look at the outcome, and then we can move into more discussion of some of the substantive ramifications or implications of what took place on Election Day and in the weeks following. So the presidency, of course, everybody kind of knows what happened, right? Joe Biden, what looks like will be an electoral college win by the margin of 306 to 232, which just happens to be the mirror reverse of Donald Trump's win in 2016. Same margin, but going the other way. The popular vote margin in favor of Mr. Biden larger than the margin between Hillary Clinton and Trump in 2016. My guess is when all is said and done, it'll be about a 7 million vote margin, somewhere in the realm of probably five percentage points, which is a clear popular vote victory. Not a huge one, but a clear one is how I would describe it. Just a couple comments on sort of the significance. Vice President Biden, or President-elect Biden, whatever we want to call him, can owe his win to reversing or returning, rebuilding the blue wall that Donald Trump managed to knock down in 2016 to achieve his narrow electoral college vote. And that blue wall, those are those Midwestern states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, who Donald, consistently sort of blue leaning, that have given the Democrats for several decades an edge in the electoral college. But Donald Trump managed to narrowly kind of flip those in 2016. Joe Biden flipped them back. And then he also added Georgia and Arizona, two consistently red states historically, but that have been trending purple. And Biden managed to put those in the Democratic column, and that's significant. Couple interesting tidbits. So if you remember 2016, Donald Trump's win in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, you total up the margin of victory in those three states for Donald Trump, and it came to 77,000 votes. So it was narrow. It was a razor's edge, right? 77,000 votes could have shifted those three states, and Hillary Clinton would have been president for the last 4 years. This time around, Joe Biden won Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona by a total of 44,000 votes. 44,000 votes. And if you take away the electoral college votes in those three states or move them over to Donald Trump's column, we would have had a 269 tie. Okay. If you add Nevada, which Joe Biden won by 34,000 votes, then you add those to those other three states and it comes out to 78,000 votes. So about the same margin, could have been flipped, and we would have had a different president. So all that to say, pretty decisive win for Biden in the popular vote, narrow, very narrow in the electoral college vote. And in a lot of ways, almost just the reverse of what happened 4 years ago. I think the sort of the message, the overarching message is the resistance won, right? Donald Trump has been vanquished. For those who, more than anything, that was what they wanted to see happen this election cycle. At the same time, he proved to be, I think, more popular than most of us, I would argue, thought, and made it closer than what we thought. And some of that's attributable to polling, and we can talk in a little bit about that. It goes back to what I said in our earlier session. I argued, or I remember saying that Donald Trump has made it hard for himself because as president, he simply didn't seem interested in expanding his coalition as president. He spent 4 years largely preaching to the choir, playing to his base, and he made very little effort to expand that base. And it would not have taken much for him to do that, to arguably change the result. Political scientists and candidates and winners love to talk about mandates, right? That the voters have given us a mandate so that we can go act boldly. No mandate here, right? Once we look at the presidential race, what happened in the Senate, what happened in the House, what happened at the state level, it's fair to say this was a mixed message. There is no mandate for dramatic change from the public as a whole, right? But of course, here we have to remember the public is badly divided and polarized. That's the dynamic. The U.S. Senate, right? We want to make sure we look at the Senate, the House, the state races as well. Republicans went into election day with a 53-47 edge, but they were playing defense. The Democrats were playing offense. The Republicans were defending 23 or 24 states, the Democrats 11. Democrats were hoping for a pickup anywhere from 5 to 10 seats. They were badly disappointed. As of right now, 1 seat pickup, right? So right now, the Republicans have a 50-48 margin with 2 runoffs coming in the state of Georgia. And Georgia has one of these peculiar laws where if nobody on the ballot gets to 50%, you have a runoff between the 2 highest finishers. And that's happened in both Florida Senate races. One of those was a special election. That's why there were 2 in that state. And so that is coming, those runoff elections are coming on January 5. And that will determine, right, who, if Republicans manage to win 1 or 2, then they will have a majority, and Mitch McConnell will be the majority leader, and the likes of Mitt Romney and Ben Sasse and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, i.e. the more moderately right-leaning senators, will have the clout. If Democrats manage to win 2 and get to 50-50 with Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris casting tie votes, right? Then it's Chuck Schumer as majority leader, okay? And then those who are gonna have the power are the very small remnant of moderately left-leaning Democratic senators. That's Joe Manchin in West Virginia and John Tester in Montana. So this will be interesting to watch. I would argue these races are probably a toss-up. Both races on election day were very close. And now we don't have, right? We don't have Donald Trump on the ballot, which may hurt Republicans. The Republicans' argument is we're the last line of defense between a unified Democratic government. And so you need to vote us in to keep a Republican majority in the Senate to counterbalance the Democrats. And then just another thing. So I've been reading some commentary that would kind of give the edge to the 2 Republican candidates. I just don't see it that way. The other thing is the Democrats are demonstrably better candidates. They're better candidates. They're better at retail politics. They're kind of more energetic figures. Both of the Republican candidates they're not the A team. They're not particularly impressive. And then finally, right, we have what is going on with the lingering challenges by the president and his lawyers in these states where he still seems to be hoping against hope to reverse the results. And that has the potential to muck up what happens down in Georgia. I don't know if anybody saw this story yesterday. 2 of the president's former lawyers, Lynn Wood and I forget the woman's name, they were out holding a press conference north of Atlanta, and they were arguing, they were telling Republican voters to stay home as a protest, that Republicans had capitulated too quickly in Georgia. And right, the president seems happy to have people make mischief with this. And this is really interesting. This could conceivably really backfire on the Republicans in the Senate. So yeah, keep an eye on that. There's going to be gobs of money spent in the next month on those two races, and so we'll see what happens. The U.S. House of Representatives. Democrats on election day had a majority of, there were a couple of seats that were not filled. It was about 232 to 197, I believe, something like that. Democrats were anticipating and were open about kind of speculating that they would pick up 10 to 15 seats and expand their majority. That has not happened. As of today, the Democrats are at 222 and the Republicans are at 212. So a 12-seat pickup for the Republicans. One race is still too close to call. With a recount, the Republican is leading the Democrat by 13 votes. And with legal challenges to come. So one race kind of remaining out there. That can only be described as a huge disappointment for Nancy Pelosi. She now has probably I should have checked, but it's probably the narrowest majority in the House going back to World War II, probably 80 years or so. So she will have very little margin to play with. And then, of course, we're already looking at 2022 and the historical pattern. And the historical pattern is a new president, his first midterm, almost always he is losing seats in that first midterm election. So it's going to be an uphill battle for the Democratic Party in the House to sort of maintain that majority. At the governor's level, very little happened. It was sort of a status quo election. The Republicans picked up one governor's seat, that was in Montana, and only because the incumbent Republican Democrat, Steve Bullock, chose to run for the Senate. And so the Republican Lieutenant General won that seat. So Republicans have a 27-23 edge in the governor's races. And then really significantly is what happened at the state legislative level. And this a lot of times gets lost in our obsession with federal politics and especially with presidential politics. Well, what was happening at the state level, especially this cycle, is extremely important. Why? Because guess what? We're having in the midst of a census. And at the conclusion of that census, we have a new round of redistricting, reapportionment, and redistricting. And so who has, right, that is largely done by state legislatures, state government, right? So who controls chambers at the state legislative level is really important for redistricting, right? Because whoever's doing it is going to do it to benefit them and their party. That's a given, right? We know that. Well, the Democrats had put a lot of emphasis on state level politics. They had really poured a lot of money into trying to flip a handful of chambers. They were focusing on Michigan was one, Minnesota, Iowa, Texas, Pennsylvania. These were all states where they thought they would have a good chance to flip a chamber and give them more power when it comes to redistricting. And they failed. They came up empty. And in fact, the Republicans flipped both chambers in New Hampshire. And so going into redistricting, Republicans control 61 legislative chambers, the Democrats 37. And there's one that is still kind of up in the air. What's more important than that is, for those of you who have ever bet on the ponies and know what a trifecta is, it's a bet we do when we're out at the racetrack. In political circles, it refers to complete control of state government, right? So a trifecta is when one party controls the governor's mansion and both chambers of the legislature. And for redistricting purposes, that's really big, right? Because if you have the governor who's going to sign off on whatever your party does in the state legislature, you're golden, right? If you don't have that trifecta and the governor is a different party, he still may be able to wield a veto pen and kind of nullify or at least dampen what the other side is able to do. After Election Day, the Republicans have a trifecta in 24 states. The Democrats have it in 15 states. And then 11 states are kind of divided control. So there again, that kind of empirically shows that the Republicans have some kind of edge going into this. Let me pause there and kind of take a look at the chat function and see what you all are saying. Okay, so folks are kind of, yeah, adding some data. Okay, I don't need to comment on this. I'm gonna let you all look at that. Before we go and start looking at some, okay, Diana asks, how do you explain to your students Trump's refusal to acknowledge the quote unquote clear victory of President-elect Biden? So yeah, before I get into the list, let's write the big question on everybody's mind are the legal challenges, Trump's refusal to concede, right, in the face of seemingly overwhelming challenges and defeats that he's encountered in the courts. Let me give my take on it, okay, which is a little more nuanced, I think, than what you might hear from either side. So this was an election where we were overwhelmingly more voters casting votes than ever before, far and away. Looks like it'll end up at 158 or 159 million. Turnout 68%, something like that. We haven't seen anything like that in a century. And it was done in the midst of a pandemic, which meant it was done, you know, tens of millions of ballots coming in by mail, early balloting, to an extent we'd have never done before. That put and so it created all sorts of wrinkles, all sorts of challenges that we were simply not accustomed to confronting or dealing with. And so it was really important that we do what we need to do to ensure the integrity of this election, because this will likely be precedent for future elections. So we want to make sure we get it right. And so given the narrowness in any number of states in the Electoral College, I do not begrudge the president for legal challenges, okay? That in any given presidential election cycle, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of ballots get tossed out. It is a fact of life in a mass democratic election. We normally don't hear of it because it doesn't matter, but it's a given. That's a lot of ballots to have tossed out, right? And so I think, right, and not only in terms of precedent, but also legitimacy of the electoral results, right? That those, if there are questions or doubts, those are hammered out in courts of law. And so I don't begrudge the president the lawsuits. We are now a month later and there have been no victories in court for the president. And so we're kind of doing what we need to do, right? And that's fine. That's one side of it. The president's rhetoric is unconscionable in my mind. It's egregious. It cannot be defended. That it's one thing to say, people, keep your powder dry and let's let the judicial system run its course. That's one thing. It's something else altogether to say, we won, large scale fraud, right? When you have the kind of following that Donald Trump has, you are feeding a line of BS to people that assures they will not accept the result. That assures they will spend 4 years thinking the resident in the White House is an illegitimate occupant there. That cannot be defended. I thought at some point Donald Trump would do what any president does, which is to say, yep, I lost, time to go. that he continues to do this. His performance yesterday was beyond the pale. I mean, watch it. It's mind-boggling. I mean, what is coming out of his mouth, the assertions he is making, utterly without justification. And this is happening while his party is fighting to prevail in two razor-close Senate runoffs in Florida that will determine if the Republican Party can hold a majority in the US Senate. The level of narcissism that allows him to do that, even when it appears it may hurt his party's chances in those two election runoffs, is something I didn't think even Donald Trump was capable of. So this is, you know, he's not going to win. There's no evidence that there's anything that could, there will be some improprieties. Absolutely. That happens in a large scale election. There will be mistakes. There's no evidence of fraud that I've heard of. Okay. And if there is, that'll be determined in a court of law, but it's not going to reverse the results. That's clear. And so to really undermine the process and the legitimacy of the ultimate winner, I really think that is a dangerous game. It continues to feed this polarization that is utterly toxic in our national politics and amongst our parties. So I don't know if anybody has a different view. I'm happy to take a pause, and if somebody wants to sort of argue the case, I'm happy to hear it. Or if you just have other kind of thoughts or questions on that kind of all the legal machinations before we move on.
Dr. Ryden,
Yep.
A number of news sources have reported a somewhat cynical interpretation of the president's litigation and his rants. That he knows very well that he's not going to prevail in the courts, but so far, by putting out millions of requests for donations under the pretext of supporting his legal challenges, he's raised over $170 million. And if you read the fine print, almost none of it goes to supporting the legal challenges. It's going into a private super PAC and paying off campaign debts. Do you think that that's a credible explanation for what the man is doing?
Far be it from me to ever try to get into Donald Trump's brain. That's a place I prefer not to go. So I don't know. It's suspicious. I don't like it. Cynicism, or at least skepticism, certainly is warranted. I would be more inclined to say Donald Trump cannot leave the stage. His self-absorption just simply will not allow him to leave the stage. A little later on the outline, when I want to talk about the future of the Republican Party, right, one of the questions looming is whether he ever will leave the stage, or whether he's going to linger for years and continue to wreak havoc and contemplate a run in 4 years hence. I would say that, right, if Donald Trump is even thinking that far ahead, I mean, he is someone who just, he doesn't operate that way. From him, I think it's always in the moment. Yeah, I don't know. So it's worth thinking about. It's worth, keeping that in our minds. Someone said, have the Democrats ever accepted Trump? No, of course they haven't. No, there's two-faced hypocrisy all over the place, right? You can read, I mean, Democratic efforts to undermine President-elect Trump happened before he took the oath of office, right? They viewed him as illegitimate, and not only because of the razor-close election, although that contributed to it, right? They just thought Donald Trump was not worthy to occupy the Oval Office, and right, the efforts to resist and undermine his presidency started before he ever took office. Absolutely, that is clear. And it was, right, the resistance included the massive, overwhelming majority of the federal bureaucracy, certainly the media, and many others. But that's different than, it is different in kind, which is to undermine the election results. So there were some who in 2016 did claim, right, who had issues with the Electoral College and claimed like that narrow 77,000 votes, right, really made him illegitimate. But not to, but it different in kind than to what the president is saying now, which is I won and there was massive fraud that made the other guy the winner. And that really is to create a different kind of mindset among this devoted following. He cling to every word that the president says. So yeah, absolutely. I acknowledge the hypocrisy on the Democratic side, but I think it was different in kind. I don't know if others feel that way, but that's kind of how I see it. What do you think of new systems? I'm sorry, there was another, and I'm just gonna I want to keep an eye on the time so we can get through some of my outline, but I appreciate the questions. What do you think of the new systems of counting votes several days after the date of the election? What about matching votes to signatures? Should we have national standards for the election? Great question. And yes, add to that final question, yes. One thing that has to come out of this, and probably won't, is serious election reform, how we do elections. Our system, and normally, I love federalism. I'm a big fan of federalism. To me, federalism, so this division of power between centralized authority and state and local governments, I'm a huge fan. It's the genius of the American constitutional system. And ideally, it gives us unity and diversity at the same time. The one area where I struggle with that is in the authority to run elections, which is given to the states. So under the Constitution, right, states have the authority to set out the rules as to how they conduct their elections. So there are 50 state election laws, right? And everybody's doing it differently. So you could even see that in this election cycle, after kind of what happened after election night, and how ballots were being casted and or being counted, and how the results were changing, and in Wisconsin and Michigan and in Pennsylvania and Georgia, right? The Republican lead was there, and it shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and in most of those cases eventually flipped. And then in Arizona and Nevada, it was the opposite. And the Democrat had bigger leads, and it gradually shrank because people were doing it differently, right? And so if we're going to move to a system where there's a large amount of mail-in balloting, early voting, there's no reason we cannot have a means of counting and ensuring the integrity of those ballots by the end of election, right? Lots of other countries do it, and do it without the drama and the stretching out that we do. And it is largely a function of this federal arrangement where states have the primary authority. So it's very difficult to do nationwide kind of national election reform. We absolutely need it. So the questioner mentioned, right, matching signatures to the ballot. And yeah, I mean, with mail-in voting, there's all sorts of questions about the integrity of the ballot, and those need to be carefully scrutinized, and there need to be rules in place for doing that. So I have my kind of thoughts, but mine aren't necessarily gospel. But yeah, I think it's absolutely essential, and the odds of it happening are slim to none. And it's one more victim of our deep polarization, I think. All right, so I'm gonna sort of head to the outline, and if you go on the back page of the outline, if you're able to see it, it's kind of the main takeaways, and then if we have time, some additional observations. And I'll try to move through these quickly, but as I speak, please feel free to raise questions. So kind of question, sort of the first takeaway, and this is more of a question than firm ideas on my part. And that's just kind of one of the big questions, right? Elections are supposed to have consequences, right? Elections are important because they give rise to the representative governance through which we, the people, govern, right? So there's meant to be a connection between elections and the governance that follows. So we shouldn't just, I oftentimes tend to kind of hopscotch over like substantive issues and what ought to come out of them. But let's just start there quickly. What can we expect from a Biden administration? I just kind of ticked off issues that, number one, are important to Biden and to the Democratic Party. And number two, where there are significant differences between, right, a Biden administration, surely likely to be, and a Trump administration. Right off the bat, COVID relief is kind of dominating the headlines, right? There's been a very encouraging bipartisan proposal put forth. That's great to see, right? Issues of trade and immigration, big differences between the parties, though, trade is likely to be high on the new administration's agenda. Taxes, healthcare, although it's unclear what the Democratic Party will be able to do on healthcare, education, climate change, infrastructure, right? These are kind of the main items on the agenda. Kind of the interesting follow-up is, I think many assume Joe Biden will be a lame duck president the moment he takes the oath of office, that he's 78. I think some wonder if he hasn't lost some of the sharpness intellectually. Right? Is he going to be a two-termer if he has a good first term? I think even people who are fans of his kind of doubt it, right? And so that could have consequences for how he governs, how he leads as president, right? If in his mind, if he's a one-term lame duck, on the one hand, one of the big questions over all of this is to what extent will Joe Biden try to do something in a bipartisan fashion, right? Will he make any effort to try to work with the Republican Party that is sort of digging in its heels to resist? If he's a one-termer, he may be freed up to do that and really to do more from the center. Or conversely, he may feel kind of more beholden to kind of the left wing of his party. That's going to be a big question, I think. What happens in Georgia obviously is going to determine, right, and who has the majority in the Senate as to whether he can be more aggressive and kind of go big on some of these policy issues, or whether it's more small ball, it's modest, it's incremental, right? If it's a Republican Senate, it's almost surely more incremental. That will also determine whether he can really pursue things at a legislative level versus as an executive order kind of president, which, right, increasingly presidents, when they run into resistance on the other side, they simply resort to the executive order where they can bypass legislative action. And so that will be interesting to see. David Brooks, I don't know if anybody saw, this was maybe a couple weeks ago, and he wrote a very nice column about what Donald Trump needed to do, or what Joe Biden needed to do, how he could govern from the center. And David Brooks kind of, sort of envisioned this nice picture of Joe Biden and a bipartisan core of senators finding agreement on some issues where there's potential consensus and urging him to do that. To which I would say that's fanciful at best. And I don't mean to rain on people's parade. I don't want to be a downer before he's even taken the oath, but I just think that's pie in the sky. And it's pie in the sky because of the second bullet point on my outline, which is the reality of a polarized partisan parity that phrase. And it's a phrase Michael Barone is one of the great kind of commentators on politics and on the parties. And I can't take credit for this, but it's a great term, polarized partisan parity. And so this morning, I went back, and since 1992, we have had, so Bill Clinton became president, we've had 15 election cycles, 15. Since 1992, there has been a change in one or more of the president or either house of Congress in 11 of those 15 cycles. Okay, a change in 11 out of 15. The last 4 presidents who either won election or won re-election, who entered the midterm with unified government, with their party holding both houses of Congress, lost it. Clinton in 94, Bush in 2006, Obama in 2010, Trump in 2018. So since 1994, unified government has given us what I call negative accountability. It gives the public the ability to hold the party in power accountable, and they do it in a negative fashion. They kick the bums out, and usually it's a drubbing. And that compares differently to what preceded it. So, right, from the mid last century to the 1990s, right, we had overwhelming Democratic dominance in Congress, especially in the House, right? Since 1992 and 1994, it's parity, and it's polarized parity, meaning the middle has disappeared. The parties are close in terms of power and in balance. And because of that, the overwhelming motivation is to, if you're the opposition party to the president, the motivation is to play hardball, right? The motivation is to oppose, because guess what? If Democrats win one of those races, right, for Republicans, 2022 is close, and a majority in both House and Senate is within reach. And there's motivation to play hardball and to resist and to oppose at all costs. And the other party's done it, and the Republicans are going to give payback. You can count on it. Okay, so that's the challenge that is before President-elect Biden. Somebody in the chat talked about him as he's a Senate institutionalist, right? He spent decades and decades in the Senate. And his instinct, I think, is to try to do things through the Senate. But the practical reality is it's a different world, even from when he served in the Senate, right, up until 2008. Much has changed in the last 12 years. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge. All right, there are a few in the chat, so let me kind of pause and see what you're saying. Somebody asked, do you support Michigan's new gerrymandering process? I assume you mean the independent commission doing the redistricting, right? I hope they wouldn't gerrymander. Gerrymandering, by definition, is when the parties do it and they do it to benefit themselves for partisan gain, right? The whole idea of putting this in the hands of an independent commission was to take the partisan motivation out of it, right? To remove the partisan shaping of the lines. I have no idea what to expect. I don't think anyone does. We don't know how they're going to operate. I didn't particularly like the proposal when it passed. I thought the idea of having an independent commission was a good one, but I thought this one was poorly drafted. I thought it had a very cynical view of politics. And so people who could qualify to be on the commission had to know nothing about politics and couldn't be related or even have relationships with anybody who knew anything about politics. It had a very cynical view of politics. And that really assures we get people who don't know anything. So I didn't like how the independent commission was to be constituted. But we'll see. Maybe I'm proven wrong. Maybe this will work out great. It's going to be interesting to watch. So I'm not going to make any predictions on that. Are people in Congress altruistic at all, or is power that addicting? Yes, of course they're altruistic. Yeah, the big lie is that Congress people are all corrupt. They're ambitious, absolutely. But I know I've sat on panels with Pete Hoekstra. Every time I do our Washington DC program, I spend 4 or 5 hours after work hours with Bill Huizenga as he gives our students a history lesson, walking us through the Capitol building. I've had conversations with other Congress people. Yes, and they do what they do, most of them, because they're motivated by service. The life of a congressman or a senator, it's not fun. They make incredible sacrifices, right? And so balance that with their ambition, right? Absolutely, that's a part of it. And certainly they are desirous of re-election. If there's a problem, it's the obsession with re-election. And so, one of the dismaying things in the past 4 years has been the unwillingness of many Republicans who in their private moments, they are rolling their eyes at Donald Trump. And this is someone whose policies are different than theirs, who they're people of faith, or they desire a healthy kind of civic fabric to our politics. And they see Donald Trump destructive of that. But the system keeps them from being honest and open about that. That's troubling. At some point, you have to say, I'm going to do what's right. And if it gets me drummed out of office, it gets me drummed out of office. But no, I don't share this deep cynicism about people in Congress. I think by and large, they're good people. They're well motivated. The system is deeply flawed. And someone like Bill Huizenga, when he was in the state legislature, he was notable for his ability to work with Democrats to get legislation passed. He did it very well, He has gone to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's unable to operate that way. The system, sort of drives the parties apart. The threat of a challenge from his right is greater than a significant challenge from a Democrat as the district is constituted. So there are all sorts of kind of structural dynamics that make it awfully difficult. And yet, there are many ways in which Congress people are doing a good job, So constituency service. And what they do, And I've had my students who work in Senate and congressional offices, And they are, It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, When a constituency needs help, needs assistance, has a question, you're doing it. And so, yeah, I think they deserve more credit than we give them. Somebody asked, how many congressional seats are determined by the Republican trifectas? That's a great question. So Sean Trende, and here I'll give you a little bit of homework for you to do. Sean Trende is he's kind of a younger Michael Barone. He is really has just a granular knowledge of American politics, right down to the counties and the precincts. And shortly after the election, he did a 2-part Trende, Trende, Sean Trende. And if you just Google it and redistricting, these articles will come up. He went through every state, all 50 states, and he did his best to predict how redistricting, what it would likely do to the balance of parties. Okay, and there were lots of caveats and qualifiers, right? He's kind of rubbing the crystal ball, but knowing him, he's probably going to be close to being right. And so he went through all 50 states. He was gauging who's going to gain seats after the census, right? Michigan's going to lose a seat. Texas is going to gain seats. Minnesota, my home state, I think is going to lose a seat. California, for the first time, is going to lose a seat or two because people are exiting California. And he went through state by state, and he came to the conclusion that just redistricting, reapportionment, so states either gaining or losing seats, and then looking at who had the trifecta, who was going to be doing the line drawing. He had Republicans picking up like 7 or 8 just on redistricting. So remember, right now, 222 to 212, right? A 10-seat majority. So if Republicans pick up 8, Democrats are losing 8, that would give Republicans the majority right there, right? And that's even before we get to this historical pattern of, right, the incumbent president's party usually losing seats. So when I say that's why the Dems have kind of an uphill battle, that's why, okay? John Kleinhexel asked, how can people of faith speak and live, find media to counteract the divisive age in which we live? Boy, that's a great question, John. And for those of you who are people of faith, take it seriously. We could do a whole session on that. I do a fair amount of speaking at churches and, right, adult Sunday schools. I spoke to our chapel on Hope's campus where I talked about these kinds of things. And it's complicated, right? People of faith, we belong to 2 kingdoms. And those kingdoms are diametrically opposed, not opposed, but fundamentally different, right? And I'm a Christian, and for me as a Christian, right, the kingdom of Christ calls from me a different set of loyalties, and those prevail over my belonging to that other kingdom, which involves individual leaders and political parties and political philosophies or ideologies. And it's a hard business. So very quickly, as people of faith, I think we are compelled to be involved. We are compelled to try to make politics better, healthier, and not to run in the opposite direction. And yet that's challenging because politics is divisive. It's inherently divisive and it drives us apart. And it is very easy to get those 2 kingdoms mixed up, right? So the Republican Party in particular, right, has sort of suffered this critique that they've too closely wedded the 2 kingdoms, right? And that the Republican Party or conservatism has become the stand-in for kind of faith convictions, right? And for people of faith, right, those convictions ought to drive our politics and ought to shape our politics and not the other way around. And yet for all of us, and I'm guilty of this, right? I'm guilty of I'm not a partisan, so that doesn't lure me, but I do have sort of philosophical ideas and a certain kind of ideological kind of orientation. And a lot of times that can be where I start. And then I kind of reshape or reorient my faith to match it. And in my mind, that's a form of idolatry. I just think Christians can really be salt to the world. I think just a few things. One is to avoid this obsession with national level politics and to really lower, and this would be for anyone, even if you're not a person of faith, but if you want to be involved and if you want to try to improve, right, the tone of our politics, these would apply as well. But one is to just focus on the politics where we can make a difference. And that's that which is closer to us and at a lower level. I mean, politics is so toxic at the national level. It's so polarized. It's so abstract. To step into that for people of faith can be messy. How we how we interact with other people. You know, I tell students and I tell every group I'm in front of, get the heck off of social media. Get off it. I'm telling you, get off it. It can do no good. I can't think of a mode of interaction that is more constituted to do ill than to do good. And it's an echo chamber. It brings out the worst in people, right? It's producing sort of the cancel culture and all this sort of thing. And then just to try to find commonality, right? So as a Christian, I am sort of told, I am trained to think of every person I meet as someone who bears the image of my Creator, right? An image bearer of God. And that means I have to think of them and treat them in a certain way, even when they're ticking me off, even when I think their politics is so wrong-headed, that has to shape how I think about them and how I treat them. For me, I'm competitive. I'm an old athlete. I'm a former litigator as a lawyer. You know, I love the rough and tumble, roly-poly dimension of politics, and I can get carried away. It's a kind of an innate sort of danger point for me. So for me, I have to know, number one, I look for people who maybe don't think like me, but who are sort of like-hearted. So not like-minded, but like-hearted. And people who I know are going to give me a fair listen, and I'm going to give them a fair listen. And those are the people with whom you can have good conversation, open conversation. And conversely, I know who to avoid. I'm from a family of like uber competitive athletes. And I have brothers, right, on opposite ends of the political spectrum. I don't ever want to see them meet to talk about politics. And I know I can't do it with either one of them. I love them too much, and I don't want kind of politics to get in the way of that. So for some of us, we have to know and really be mindful of who not to mix it up with and where not to go. Find some real community. I think these are tough questions. To figure it out alone is really challenging. There are great resources out there, and to do some reading and thinking and book clubs, or to do it in your Sunday school class. So this fall, yeah, I did just a number of gatherings with local churches and was really impressed that people in churches were willing to do that and willing to have those conversations. That's a first start. For John and for others, send me an email. I would love to share some resources. So I think on the outline, did I? Yeah, my email address is there. I don't want to use up all this time if this isn't of interest to some of you. But I'd be happy to share some good resources that you might be able to spend some time reading and thinking about. Sometimes I think the liberals have made their politics a religion, and the conservatives have made their religion political. That's one other thing I would add is I love politics, but it's really important that we have a sense of perspective about politics. You know, politics is not the be all and the end all. And yet we treat it like it is. That's one of the problems with national level politics, where it happens on an abstract scale. It's really easy to lose perspective and to blow it out of proportion. And so there are some issues. So I'm kind of a centrist, I'm eclectic, right? I sort of hop over to the left or over to the right, depending on what the issue is. But there are a number of issues that I think are important. And yet the way they are dealt with in almost a religious fashion drives me away and really gets in the way of consensus. So climate change, environmentalism, right? This is an important issue. And we need to really be thoughtful and active in seeking sound policy solutions. But for some on the left, I mean, it really does take on sort of religious overtones. And then sort of so the solutions really kind of go off the deep end. So, all right, I'm gonna stop there because I don't know how we're doing for time, but I do want to get to some of these other items on my outline. So the next one, the nationalizing of our elections. because this is clearly happening, right? So political scientists talk about kind of more nationalized versus more localized elections. Many of you remember Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, the Speaker of the House back in the 70s and the 80s, good old fashioned liberal. He was doing battle with Ronald Reagan at every turn, but they got along. And he coined the phrase, all politics is local, which at the time probably was true, but it's less and less and less true. And increasingly our politics is national. And that's for a variety of reasons, right? The presidency has taken on outsized proportion in our politics, and national level politics has. The dying away of local news and local and state newspapers means people get their news from national sources, and so everything is nationalized. Right, the social media has shrunk the world, and I think removed us from kind of local concerns. And so thinking about the elections, right? These elections, I would say, were nationalized, right? And I forget, I should have looked this up, right? There's a great metaphor, and I forget who came up with it, but they kind of described politics. And this is a way to think about, you know, the election cycle just done. And they likened politics and like a presidential election to a hot air balloon. Right? And there's so much attention paid to all these particular strategies and right micro targeting and digital ads and big tech data driven campaign moves. And this person described all of that is just so much kind of grabbing the sandbags on the hot air balloon and even either throwing them off or putting them on, when in fact, the thing that was really going to determine where that hot air balloon is going is the weather, right? And the weather is that's the big environment in which an election takes place, right? The election is the overarching environment. And that might be the economy, right? Or cultural forces, or right, an anti-incumbency mood, right? And so, and within that larger weather or environmental kind of reality, campaigns can try to make some moves. They can try to shape their message and talk about things or highlight things that might give them some benefit, but only to a certain extent. So that's a way to kind of think about this election cycle, right? I think about Donald Trump as sort of the storm, right? For the first 3 years of his presidency, he was the storm that just kind of came and settled on this country. That was the weather. And it just dominated everything. And that and the economy up until the pandemic, you know, was probably healthy enough, strong enough that Donald Trump was going to get reelected. I honestly think he was in pretty good shape to win reelection like a year ago. Okay. And then some big weather factors happened. Well, one of them was the impeachment. Like we forget the impeachment was this year. It seems like 5 years ago. But that only seemed to enhance kind of Trump's standing. Then the pandemic comes along, right? That was another storm that completely changed the weather in the direction of the hot air balloon. That was the presidential campaign. And clearly that, right? So that just, right, that leads to huge health consequences, economic consequences, shutdowns in people's lives and work in all sorts of ways. And that completely altered the direction of the campaigns, right? Now, within that context, the campaigns and the candidates were trying to message and to manage. And I would say Democrats did a very good job of messaging. They did a very good job of laying the pandemic from a health perspective at Donald Trump's feet. Okay, and so even though much of it was decentralized, he really became the person who received the blame for it. And that was sort of effective messaging by the Democrats. And he was awful. I mean, if you remember that first debate, right, he was awful. I mean, he could not give an account of his response to the pandemic or even what he was planning to do. That's failing within this broader environment, right, to do as best you can with your message and with your campaign. But within that larger environment for Joe Biden, it was enough then for him to simply not be Trump, right? It was enough for him to kind of stay in his basement and to run what I thought was largely substanceless, right? Not a lot of substance to his campaign. That was enough, right? Another sort of weather event came with George Floyd's death and all the unrest that followed that. That became a second huge kind of change in the environment, okay? And especially when that kind of morphed into something different, right? When the pictures on the TV or the stories in the paper, right, started to talk about defunding the police, right? And when it kind of morphed from social justice into something different, right? And there was violence in the street, right? That worked in the other direction, that tended to work against the Democratic Party. And they're the Republicans, like especially candidates for the House and the Senate. They were quite effective in tarring the Democrats with defund the police and socialism and these sorts of things. So I think that kind of ended up, those are some two sort of big environmental things that really kind of what ultimately happened, right, helps explain some of that. Another thing I just want to mention is polling, and there's been some talk about this, but one cannot describe this election as anything other than a massive failure in the realm of polling. And I would normally say, well, so what? What's the big deal? Except the polls are so pervasive, right? We are drowning in tracking polls for months and months and months before the election, to the point where I think they can impact how people think about voting, how they think about candidates. They can impact how elections happen. And that can no longer be justified or defended. And so, like on a nationwide level, the polls weren't that bad. If Biden wins by 5 points, they were close to that. But if you get down to some of the key battleground states, they were significantly off. I haven't, I've looked at Wisconsin and Florida, Texas, Iowa, Ohio. And if you look at the real clear average of the polls before Election Day and what the result was, on average, they were 6 or 7 points off, right? That's well outside any margin of error. When you get to some Senate races, it was worse. Susan Collins of Maine, the last 14 polls done, she was behind, oftentimes by as much as 7, 8, 9 points. People had written her off. She ends up winning by 10 points. Kind of similar results in Montana, in Iowa. The Cook Report. The Cook Report is one of the most respected political analysts out there. Going into Election Day, based on their polls and their surveys, they ranked 27 House races as toss-ups. 27. Republicans won every single race. 27 out of 27 supposed toss-ups, right? That's a problem with polling. Why? What happened? If you recall our earlier meeting, I talked about this shy Trump voter, right? After seeing Trump vilified and his supporters vilified, there's something called social bias going on and wanting to avoid the judgment of the surveyor. Or a kind of a parallel to that, I think, is the kind of fake news mindset where Trump supporters would lump pollsters in with mainline news outlets, ballots and just mess with them on purpose. So this is interesting that polling is simultaneously, polling is getting more sophisticated and less reliable at the same time. And it is getting harder and harder and more of a challenge for pollsters to come up with what is a truly representative sample that will give us insight to election day. And given that, if I could wave a magic wand, I would eliminate 90% of the tracking polls leading up to the elections. And there's really no reason for it, right? The parties, the candidates, they'll have their internal polls, right? They use those to make strategic decisions and shape messages and the like. Those are justified. Exit polls are justified, right? Exit polls actually help us try to understand the electorate, to try to understand and discern what the meaning was behind the election results. Those make sense. But tracking polls nonstop for months ahead of time, if we could only do away with them. Unfortunately, the news outlets, it's big business for them. But man, take them with a grain of salt. Let me just, so how are we doing time-wise? Let me just say a couple words about kind of the future of the two parties, and then we can, whatever time is left, happy to entertain some questions. Because this is just a fascinating time, right? And it's a challenging time. So on the Democratic side, right, it took 1 day, 2 days after the election for kind of the cracks, the fissures within the Democratic Party to show themselves. And it was like on a Thursday after a Tuesday election day, and the Democratic caucus for the House of Representatives gathered for kind of a family meeting, they called it. And it was a family meeting that got very nasty very quick. And there was a more kind of moderately left-leaning congresswoman from New York, I think, who barely survived. And she just let charge. She just let it out and blaming kind of the more liberal wing of the party and saying it was national messaging on defund the police and socialism that cost us a bunch of vulnerable, kind of more centrist Democrats. And 1 day later after that, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she fired back, and she and the squad. And next thing you know, you had this intra-party squabble. And it's more than a squabble. It's really sort of a fight for the heart of the party and how they think someone like Joe Biden should lead them. And right, do they sort of move more to the center? Do they move more to the left? And it is a little bit like the Tea Party was for the Republicans 10 years ago, which is they have an element on the far left who are very progressive that kind of mirror the Tea Party and the Republican Party, but they are not, they have outsized importance because they're really effective. So I'm thinking about AOC, Omar from Minnesota, Taib from the eastern side of this state, and who's the fourth one? Anyway, they're great at social media. They are fearless, and they are far to the left, and they want to pull the party that way, okay? And so they have outsized influence, even though they're not the critical mass of the party. And yet and that's kind of where the Tea Party was, which was not the mass, they weren't the majority in the Republican Party, but they were effective messengers and they were unified and they were energetic. And so for the Democratic Party and for Joe Biden, this is a huge question right off the bat. For the Democratic Party, right, for about 15 years now, commentators have been sort of predicting that the Democratic Party was made up of a coalition that would eventually become a permanent majority. And they call that sort of the coalition of the ascendant. And it was made up of those elements in our society that are growing, and that this will grow into a permanent majority. Young people, minorities, professional women, and the professional class kind of writ large. after this election, that looks questionable. In large part because it's hard to hold a coalition together. And it's always hard for the Democratic Party, right? They're more of the big tent party. It's always a challenge to kind of keep their coalition unified. And so after this election, where guess what? I mean, the Republican Party, 28 new women in the Republican caucus in the next session of Congress. Right? Improvement among minorities, African American and Hispanic and Asian, for Donald Trump of all people, right? It's still relatively small, but it's also not insignificant. And these are kind of chinks in that Democratic coalition. And so, yeah, right, the Democrats have been characterized and criticized as just becoming increasingly more metropolitan and sort of liberal, kind of the liberal professional class. And that they are completely at odds with flyover country, with working class, that they are no longer the party of the working class. And I think that's true. And yet they are very much wedded to a donor class that reflects that. And they're urban, cosmopolitan, very liberal, professional, and their economics and their cultural views are far to the left. And far to the left of minorities, right? So in some ways, they're sort of out of step with African Americans and Hispanic Americans who tend to be more conservative on social issues. And so this is going to be this is a challenge. It's going to be something interesting to watch with the Democratic Party. On the Republican Party, I think the big question is there Trumpism after Trump? And of course, Trumpism means different things to different people. And so one form of, I have a colleague of mine, and he would describe Trumpism as this deep suspicion of elites. And it's academic elites, it's party elites, it's corporate elites. And their view that the elites are corrupt and they don't care about normal people. They don't care about working class people. And Donald Trump put a voice and a persona to that. Okay, that's one form of Trumpism. I think that's kind of a dead end form of Trumpism. A second form of Trumpism is not a dead end, and it's substantive. And that's whether there can be a healthier kind of combination of conservatism and populism that is based in the working class, that can do a better job of appealing to minorities and doesn't treat them in an antagonistic way. And it's built around things like trade and borders and right things that are more populist. A bit of an America first, and right, that idea has been tarred because it's Trumpian, but it's a popular notion among Americans across ethnic and racial lines. And so, right, we see this more than anything, we see a class divide among the parties. And so the Republican Party, right, several people said this after the election, the Republican Party is now the populist party. And so, right, is there a healthier version of populism that, right, without the coarseness and the cruelty and the crassness of Donald Trump that drives so many people away? So think of a Tom Cotton in the Senate, or Josh Hawley, or I think Dan Crenshaw. If you know who he is, the congressman down in Texas, the Navy SEAL with the patch over his eye, who's kind of a social media maven. He would be a popular face for populism, right? Is there a future for that? And there are Republicans working on that. Unfortunately, there's a third version of Trumpism, and that's Trump himself, right? That's the personality of Trump, right? And this Trumpism comes out of, right, people who feel abandoned, left behind, and Trump's smash mouth approach to politics is actually what attracts them, right? And what is responsible for their loyalty to him through thick and thin. And if that's the case, well, then there's no Trumpism after Trump. Trump is Trumpism, right? And then Dan Crenshaw or Tom Cotton, they're not going to earn the same sort of loyalty because they lack that sort of visceral, in your face, take no prisoners approach that is Donald Trump. And then finally, Donald Trump may simply never go away, right? This is Donald Trump, is he going to linger for 4 more years? Is he going to create his own media empire and spend that time, right, taking pot shots at both parties and then take another run in 2024? If so, that's going to suck all the air out of the Republican Party's efforts to try to rebuild a healthier populism. So both sides, both parties are looking at huge challenges. I could say more, but I don't. Let's see what time it is. I think I want to stop. And yeah, 2:25. So let's see if we can get a few comments or questions from you all. Who's got some? I'm not gonna let you out before 2:30. Come on, folks. You know me. Kind of comments or questions or pushback on anything I've said?
I'm concerned about the way you're speaking. Are you suffering from some malady?
Oh no, I'm fine. I just have a tickle in my throat. So I
You're
keep
sure? You're
No,
sure?
thanks, Peg. I'm fine. Yeah. Other than spending too much time with my children these days. Everybody's
That
getting
has other
everyone's
symptoms.
nerves. What's that?
That has other symptoms.
Right.
And I will say this to both you and to Kim, you're too young to understand the fulfillment of what you're suffering now. Hang in there. Wait 50 years and it all pays off.
Oh, 50. Well, I won't make 50 years. But no,
Thanks
I'm a
for what you've
I'm a
done,
very
David.
old dad and so I won't tell you how old I am, but I have a 13-year-old at home and my spouse is significantly younger. And my greatest fear is that, I'm not too far removed from just losing it all. And I'll end up in our house kind of sitting over in a corner, or they'll put me on an ice floe and just give me a push and they'll go on with their lives. But that's kind of morbid. I mean, we don't need to go there.
It's also immoral to even think about it. But thanks for giving us your mind.
Yeah, so Diana Nelson asks, as a lawyer, can you help me understand how someone can pardon people who have not been convicted? No, I can't, Diana. They just can. They just can't, right? So the thing to know is the pardon power is essentially unlimited. It's unconstrained. There are not parameters. This is an area. So the only thing restraining a president in his or her use of the pardon power is customs and norms and things that have happened in the past, right? And the one thing we do know about Donald Trump is norms don't matter to him. He spent his campaign and his presidency shattering norms, right? He does so with relish. So I wouldn't expect him to abide by the norms, right? So no, the pardon power is essentially unrestrained. So if you recall back to Watergate, when Gerald Ford, he pardoned Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had not been charged with anything. He was an unindicted co-conspirator. Do you remember that phrase? So there was an example where Gerald Ford, and I think people may differ, right? I think it was a great act of courage by Ford because he was essentially shooting his reelection hopes. He was kind of flushing them down the toilet. And yet he thought it was important for the public and the country to avoid what would have been a long, drawn-out prosecution of the former president. But that was an example of, he had not been formally indicted. Yeah.
David, this is Brad.
Yep.
I think the most startling thing for me today was this hot air balloon. I mean, you hear
Does that work? Did people like that metaphor?
wow. Yeah, it works
Yeah.
for sure. And I feel like I've been in a hot air balloon in stormy weather for a long time. But I
Right.
mean, the whole notion that, yeah, it just makes sense. I mean, I had visions of Trump finding, using his micro targeting to find those extra voters through all these sophisticated methods. And yeah, it's sandbags in the storm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
It's really true. Yeah. It's a great way to think about it. Yep.
Amazing. Any
Anybody?
other questions or comments?
I'm a little disappointed. Nobody told me like just to, to get off that I was totally wrong. But maybe you're just all in a charitable Christmas spirit or something. So
Yeah, we just realized it was the hot air balloon and nobody's responsible for this. It's just the weather.
yeah, Bill Wells, do you think we're learning to lie to pollsters? Yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I would guess not many of you are doing that, right? I wouldn't think of you as being shy Trump voters. Maybe a few of you are. Maybe you could relate to that. But think about someone who's working class, right? And they have just been tarred and feathered because they had the temerity to cast a vote for Donald Trump. And if someone's asking them, right, that's social bias. Like, I'm not going to bother to tell this guy I voted for Trump. I'll tell him what he wants to hear. That's a very human, I think that's a very human response, which is why I thought that was a real deal. And so there might be some of that will continue with or without Donald Trump, right? If conservatism is sort of besmirched by a media who leans left, maybe there'll be some of that. More of it has to do with just not wanting to pick up the phone, right? I mean, we're all kind of, many people are skeptical. We don't want to take the time to do it. Cell phones are making it increasingly difficult. Just the methodology of polling just is hard. It's just tough.
One last question. Do you think that, McConnell or other Republicans should speak out against Trump and recognize Joe Biden's win at this point?
Yes, but I understand why they are hesitant too. Well, yeah. No, I don't. I think I'm no longer understanding. I got it like before the election, right? Just because the loyalty of that 40% or so to Donald Trump was unshakable, right? So he hijacked this party and he built a different coalition. And right, and if you ran afoul of that 40%, if you're a Republican, look out. So
Toast.
some Republicans were confident enough, they had standing with their state or their constituencies that they could do it. So someone like Ben Sasse in Nebraska, who I just have the greatest admiration for. I think you could Google some of his statements in hearings, and he is just flat out just open in his criticism of Donald Trump. And he won re-election by 30 points, right? Someone like that can do it. I get why others cannot. But now at some point, right, the consideration for the health of the union and for the person who is taking the Oval Office. I don't care how partisan you are, to contribute to the undermining of a new president before he even takes office. That is bad form. That is bad form. So yes, I would think, and Republicans are not, right? They are not, they wouldn't face the immediate consequences of breaking with the president. So a couple of Republicans, Kemp, the governor of Georgia, and the Secretary of State down there, both Republicans. I admire them. They're doing their job, right? And the president, he's lobbing grenades at them. and they're doing their job. So yeah, I would like to see more people do that. I think it'll continue. You see some of it, some of it happening, but there needs to be a more unified front among Republicans.
Thank you.
What,
Well,
what did you think about the Georgian election official who made those strong comments the other day again about the Republican Party? He certainly showed an awful lot of courage.
Right. Yep. I think that I assume we're maybe talking about the same person.
Well, we want to thank you very much for this session. And we want to wish you a good time in your sabbatical. And we are anxious to learn what you'll be writing about after you get back. And have you
I'm say I'm
recognized.
off the grid, but I'll see you all next fall. I trust I will be invited back. So
Absolutely, you will.
I'm
And
hoping to produce a book, and I trust that will be a subject of some sessions with the Haspers.
it will, and I'm sure we could sell a few copies here. Again, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Let's give David a hand,
David.
please.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, David.